A boy from a small nomadic tribe on the edge of a crumbling empire once had a dream. In it, a tree grew from his chest, and its branches covered 3 continents. According to most historical accounts, that boy was Osman, and 600 years later, his name would still be spoken in the title of one of the largest empires the world has ever known. But in the year 1299, none of that had happened yet. There was only a small band of Turkish warriors, camped in the hills of northwestern Anatolia, watching a dying Byzantine frontier and wondering if they dared to take a piece of it. The land they lived on was a fault line. To the east, the once mighty Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was collapsing into a patchwork of rival Turkish principalities called beyliks, each one clawing for territory and prestige. To the west lay the Byzantine Empire, ancient, wealthy, and Christian, but by this point exhausted, its armies hollowed out by civil wars, its treasury drained, its frontier forts undermanned and half forgotten by a government that had bigger problems in Constantinople. Between these two worlds stood Osman, leader of a minor beylik with perhaps a few hundred fighting men. He held no crown, no grand title, nothing but a border, a handful of loyal riders, and an ambition that historians still debate the true scale of. Did he dream of empire, or did he simply want to survive the winter? We will never know for certain. What we do know is what he did next. Osman began raiding Byzantine towns along the frontier, and here is the detail most people miss. He did not present himself only as a conqueror. He offered something the crumbling Byzantine administration increasingly could not: protection, lower taxes, and a functioning local order. Peasants exhausted by imperial neglect sometimes found the new Turkish lords less burdensome than the old Greek ones. This is one of the quiet secrets behind the Ottoman rise. It was not only the sword that built this empire, it was also the offer of stability to people who had none. By the time Osman died, probably around 1324, his son Orhan inherited a beylik that had grown from a border camp into something resembling a real state, and Orhan did what his father never managed. He took a true prize. In 1326, after a long siege, the city of Bursa fell to the Ottomans. Osman, according to several traditional accounts, was already dying as the news reached him and never lived to see the city his son would make into a capital. Bursa was not just another town. It was a hub of trade, a symbol, proof that this was no longer a raiding band, but a kingdom capable of holding walled cities against organized defense. The tree from the dream had its first real root in the ground. What happened over the next few decades would have seemed unthinkable to the terrified Byzantine border guards who first faced Osman's raiders. Orhan pressed further, capturing Nicaea, a city with deep Christian significance, followed by Nicomedia. Each conquest fed the next. More land meant more soldiers meant faster conquest, and faster conquest meant more land still. But Orhan's most consequential decision was not a battle at all. It was a marriage alliance and a foothold across the water. In the 1350s, the Ottomans were invited into the internal chaos of a Byzantine civil war, asked to send troops to Europe to support one claimant to the imperial throne. It is one of history's darker ironies. The empire that would eventually help end Byzantium was first invited in as a guest. Ottoman soldiers crossed the narrow straits of the Dardanelles into Europe, and in 1354, following an earthquake that conveniently leveled the walls of the fortress town of Gallipoli, Ottoman forces occupied it and refused to leave. For the first time, the Ottomans held territory in Europe. The tree's branches had crossed the sea. Pause here and ask yourself something. The people living through this could not have known. What does it mean when the invited guest becomes the one who never goes home? Orhan's successor, Mehmed I, turned that foothold into a flood. Adrianople, a major Byzantine city in the Balkans, fell to Ottoman forces, and Mehmed renamed it Edirne, making it his new capital, deliberately planting the seat of Ottoman power in Europe itself, not as a frontier outpost, but as a center of government. Ottoman armies pushed through Thrace, into Bulgaria, into Serbian lands, absorbing Christian principalities one by one, sometimes through conquest, sometimes through vassalage, where local rulers kept their thrones but paid tribute and sent troops when summoned. This was the second secret of Ottoman expansion. Total conquest was not always necessary. Submission would do just as well, and it was often offered as the survivable alternative. It was under Murad that the most feared instrument of early Ottoman power took shape. The Devshirme system and the core that grew from it, the Janissaries. Young boys, taken as a form of tribute mostly from conquered Christian Balkan families, were converted, trained from childhood, and forged into an elite standing infantry, loyal not to any local lord or bloodline, but directly to the Sultan alone. It is a practice modern readers rightly find difficult. a system built on forced separation from family and faith, and honest history does not soften that. But its military effect was undeniable. While most medieval European armies still depended on feudal levies, semi-trained farmers called up for a season of fighting, the Ottomans were building something Europe did not yet have. A permanent, disciplined, professional army, paid year-round, drilled constantly, and utterly dependent on the Sultan for its position and its pay. The Balkan powers finally understood the scale of the threat, and in 1389 they gathered a coalition to stop it. On the plain of Kosovo, Serbian forces under Prince Lazar met Murad's army in a battle that would echo in regional memory for centuries afterward. The fighting was ferocious, and by most historical accounts both leading commanders died in it. Murad I, killed either during or shortly after the fighting, reportedly by a Serbian noble named Miloš Obilić, who reached the Sultan's tent under the pretense of surrender, and Lazar himself, captured and executed. Kosovo did not stop the Ottomans. If anything, the transition of power happened so smoothly, with Murad's son Bayezid immediately taking command, that it demonstrated the opposite of Balkan hopes. This was now a state that could survive the death of its ruler mid-battle without collapsing. Bayezid earned the nickname Yildirim, meaning thunderbolt, for the blinding speed of his campaigns, and for a moment it looked as though nothing in Europe could slow him. In 1396, a massive coalition of European crusaders drawn from Hungary, France, Burgundy, and beyond marched to confront him at Nicopolis, hoping to finally halt the Ottoman advance and relieve pressure on the shrinking, encircled remnant of Byzantium. It ended in catastrophe for the crusaders. Bayezid's forces crushed them, and thousands of captured knights were executed in the aftermath, a brutal event even by the standards of the age, and one that historians describe with real unease about its scale of violence toward prisoners. Constantinople itself, the last great prize, seemed within reach. Bayezid began a long blockade of the city, and it appeared the ancient Roman capital's final chapter was about to be written. Then came the reversal almost nobody saw coming, and it did not come from Europe at all. Far to the east, a conqueror named Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane, had built his own empire across Central Asia through campaigns of extraordinary brutality. Timur and Bayezid, two of the most powerful rulers of their age, collided at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, and the empire that had shattered European crusader armies was itself shattered. Bayezid was captured alive, and according to most historical accounts he died in captivity within months, a stunning and humiliating fall for a ruler who had seemed unstoppable only years before. What followed is remembered by historians as the Ottoman interregnum, more than a decade of civil war between Bayezid's surviving sons, each claiming the throne, each backed by different factions and regions, tearing at the very state their family had built. For a moment, it looked as though the Ottoman project might simply end there, in fratricidal exhaustion, one more failed Anatolian power swallowed by its own ambition. But it did not end. In 1413, one son, Mehmed, emerged victorious over his brothers and reunified the fractured realm, earning the title restorer for pulling the state back from the edge of collapse. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. This empire's history is not one unbroken line of triumph. It nearly died in its own cradle more than once, and every time it found a way back. Mehmed's son, Murad II, spent his reign steadily rebuilding Ottoman strength, defeating rival claimants, reasserting control over the Balkans, and turning back a major crusading effort at Varna in 1444. He was, by several accounts, a ruler who twice attempted to step back from the throne toward a quieter, more contemplative life, only to be pulled back each time by crisis and necessity. When he died in 1451, the throne passed to his 19-year-old son, and this is where the story of the empire's rise reaches its true climax, because that young man was Mehmed II, and he had one obsession above all others: Constantinople. For over 1,000 years, the city had stood as the capital of the Roman world, its massive triple line of land walls considered the most formidable fortifications on earth, walls that had turned back siege after siege, army after army, for a millennium. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire behind those walls was a shadow of its former self, reduced to little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories, its population a fraction of its ancient peak, its treasury nearly empty. But the walls still stood, and everyone, including Mehmed, knew that walls like these had broken far larger armies than this. So Mehmed did something unprecedented. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Orban to build the largest cannon the world had yet seen, a bombard so massive it reportedly required dozens of oxen and hundreds of men simply to move it into position, capable of firing stone shot that could shatter walls no army had ever breached by force. Alongside it, Mehmed massed a fleet and an army numbering in the tens of thousands against a defending garrison. Historians estimate at only a few thousand men, aided by a small number of foreign volunteers, most notably a Genoese commander named Giovanni Giustiniani, who arrived with his own soldiers to help defend the dying city. The siege began in early April of 1453. For weeks, the massive Ottoman guns pounded the ancient walls day after day, and defenders worked through the nights repairing the breaches with wood, rubble, anything they could find, in a desperate race against the next morning's bombardment. Then Mehmed did something that still stuns military historians today. The Byzantines had blocked the Golden Horn, the city's inner harbor, with a great chain, preventing any Ottoman ships from entering and attacking that weaker stretch of wall. So Mehmed ordered his engineers to build a greased wooden track over land, behind the hills, and in a single night his forces hauled a fleet of ships overland, launching them directly into the harbor the defenders had believed was sealed. The defenders woke to find an enemy navy where none should have been able to reach. On the 29th of May, 1453, after nearly 2 months of siege, the final assault came. Ottoman forces broke through, reportedly through a small gate called the Kirkoporta that had been left unlocked, and the ancient capital fell. Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, is said by most accounts to have thrown off his imperial regalia and died fighting in the final chaos at the walls, his body never conclusively identified afterward. A city that had stood as the heart of the Roman world for over 1,000 years, that had survived Persian sieges, Arab sieges, Crusader sieges, and countless would-be conquerors, fell in a single night to a 21-year-old sultan. Mehmed rode into the city and, according to most historical accounts, wept not only in triumph, but reportedly reciting a line about the impermanence of even the greatest empires as he looked upon the fallen splendor around him. He renamed himself Fatih, the Conqueror, and made the city his new capital, allowing it to be resettled and rebuilt rather than left as ruins, restoring its role as a great center of trade and learning under a new banner. What had begun a century and a half earlier as a dream, a border camp, and a few hundred riders on the edge of a dying empire, had become the master of that empire's own capital. The rise was complete, but it had never once been guaranteed. It survived civil war, a catastrophic defeat at Ankara, and the death of its own founder before the walls of the city he never lived to see fall. Every step of it was built on the same pattern. Patience where patience served, ruthlessness where ruthlessness served, and always, the willingness to adapt faster than the empires crumbling around it could respond. So when you look at a map of the Ottoman Empire at its height, stretching eventually across 3 continents, remember that it did not begin with an empire at all. It began with a tribe, a dream about a growing tree, and a small border camp that refused to disappear. What does that tell us about how the greatest powers in history actually begin? Not with certainty, but with people who simply would not stop. Tell me in the comments which turning point in this story surprised you the most. And if you want the next chapter of this story, the one where the Ottomans reach the gates of Vienna, subscribe so you don't miss it.